Marcus Ellsworth had ridden out of Caldwell, Kansas 3 times in his life, and every single time, the dust had barely settled on his boots before the town found a new way to reach into his chest and drag him back. The first time he left, he was 22 years old and full of the kind of blind confidence that only young men with nothing to lose could manage. He had packed his saddlebags with a change of clothes, a skinning knife, and the last letter his father had written before the consumption took him. He had pointed his horse, a brown and white paint he called Juniper, north toward Abilene, where a cattle outfit was hiring drovers for a 3-month push into Nebraska. He had said his goodbyes at the Silver Spur Saloon with a glass of rye in his hand and a grin on his face. He had told the barkeep, old Owen Tate, that Caldwell was too small for a man with ambition. Owen had laughed at that, the way old men laugh at things they know will change. Marcus had made it 40 miles before the rider caught him. A boy named Denny Prout, 14 years old and breathless on a spotted gray horse, had told him that his neighbor Hector Bales had been found badly beaten in the alley behind the feed store, and that the man who did it was boasting openly in the street. Hector Bales was the closest thing Marcus had to an uncle. He had taught Marcus to shoe a horse and to read the weather by the color of the horizon. Marcus had turned Juniper around without a second thought. He stayed in Caldwell for another 2 years after that, long enough to see the matter with Hector resolved through the county sheriff, and long enough to watch Hector fully recover and marry a widow woman who ran a pie shop on Merchant Street. When Marcus finally left the second time, he was 24, and he told himself that Caldwell's hold on him was done. He rode south toward the Cherokee Strip, following work as a ranch hand on a spread outside of Hunwell. That lasted 8 months before a grass fire tore through the surrounding county and the owner of the spread, a man named Caulfield, lost everything in a single week. Work dried up like a creek bed in August, and Marcus found himself drifting back toward familiar territory, following the old cattle roads north until the familiar low skyline of Caldwell appeared through the heat shimmer like an apology. The third time he left, he was 27, and he had a good reason. He had signed on as a scout with a surveying crew that was mapping parcels of land west of Wichita. Good honest work that paid a weekly wage and moved him away from Caldwell by degrees, like a man easing himself out of deep water. He had lasted nearly a year on that job, learning the lay of the Kansas flatlands as they spread toward Colorado territory, and he had genuinely believed he was gone for good. But the crew's lead surveyor had taken sick in the spring of 1882, and the work had paused, and Marcus had ridden back to Caldwell simply because he had nowhere else in particular to go. He was 28 years old by the time he settled back into Caldwell for what he privately promised himself would be the last time he allowed it to happen. He took a room above the hardware store on Kisham Street, accepted work as a deputy for the town marshal, a steady, quiet man named Amos Garrett who had been keeping the peace in Caldwell since the cattle drives were in their heyday. The work was not glamorous. It was patrolling the stockyards at night and breaking up card games gone ugly, and escorting drunken cowboys to the jail cell to sleep off their indulgences. It was a life, Marcus told himself, even if it was not the life he had imagined when he was 22 and full of empty confidence. The year was 1883. Caldwell sat at the edge of the Cherokee Strip in southern Kansas, and while the wildest days of the cattle drives were winding down, the town still had enough energy in it to keep a man occupied. The stockyards still drew longhorn herds out of Texas in the warm months, and with the cattle came the cowboys, the gamblers, the whiskey peddlers, and the men who rode in from the strip with their hats pulled low and their business best kept quiet. It was not a quiet town, but Marcus had learned to read it the way a fisherman reads a river, knowing where the currents were strong and where they only appeared to be. He had not been planning to fall in love. He had not been planning anything particularly remarkable on the Tuesday morning in April when he walked into Nell Bright's dry goods store on Merchant Street to pick up a canvas bag of feed that Amos Garrett had ordered the week before. The store was warm and smelled of coffee and dried herbs, and the particular dusty sweetness of bolts of cotton fabric. Nell Bright was not behind her counter, which was unusual, and Marcus stood at the door for a moment, his hat in his hands, looking around the cluttered space. Then the door to the back room opened, and Irene Vaughn walked out carrying a crate of tinned goods that was visibly too heavy for her, and Marcus Ellsworth's carefully maintained plan to eventually leave Caldwell for good met its fourth and most formidable obstacle. She was 24 years old, he would later learn, with dark brown hair pinned up under a simple calico bonnet that she had clearly not bothered to straighten, and her eyes were a shade of gray-green that reminded him of the Kansas sky in the moments before a thunderstorm when the light goes flat and strange and entirely beautiful. She was wearing a blue work dress with the sleeves rolled to her elbows, and she had a smudge of dust on her left cheekbone from the back room, and she was walking with the careful, deliberate steps of a woman managing more weight than she would admit. She did not look up when she entered the room. She set the crate down on the counter with a solid thump that rattled the tins, straightened her back, and then finally noticed him standing at the door. "I did not hear you come in," she said. Her voice was clear and even the kind of voice that did not rise or fall in apology. "I just arrived," Marcus said. "Is Mrs. Bright about?" "She went to the post office," Irene said. "She should be back in a quarter of an hour. Is there something I can help you with?" He told her about the feed order. She found it recorded in a ledger on the shelf behind the counter, checked it twice with her finger running along the columns, and then told him it had already been bundled and set aside in the storage room, and she could carry it to the door for him. "I can carry it," Marcus said. "I am sure you can," she said, without particular inflection, and went into the back room anyway. He helped her carry it despite her evident self-sufficiency, and when they set the canvas bag down on the boardwalk outside, she dusted her hands on her apron and looked at him with the direct, assessing gaze of a woman who had learned to form opinions quickly. "You are the deputy," she said. "Marcus Ellsworth." "I am," he said. "And you are not from Caldwell?" A small, brief smile. "No," she said. "I am not." She had come from Wichita, he discovered over the next few days, in the way that news traveled in a small town through the natural course of conversations that were not really about gathering information at all. She had come alone, without family, and she was boarding with Nell Bright, helping in the store in exchange for the room. She had been in Caldwell for 3 weeks before Marcus first saw her, and in those 3 weeks she had apparently managed to make herself genuinely useful to Nell, who was 56, and had been running the store alone since her husband died of a fever 2 winters prior. Marcus told himself he was only curious because it was his job to know who was new in town. Amos Garrett would have said the same thing with a completely straight face before turning away to hide his amusement. The truth was simpler and more inconvenient than professional curiosity. Irene Vaughn occupied his thoughts with a persistence he found entirely unreasonable. He would be halfway through a perfectly ordinary task, checking the locks on the jail or writing a report for Garrett about a dispute at the stockyards, and he would find himself thinking about the way she had set that crate down without asking for help, or the exact shade of gray-green of her eyes in the morning light. He saw her again 4 days later when he was walking his morning patrol along Merchant Street. She was sweeping the boardwalk in front of Nell's store, and she nodded at him with a kind of measured courtesy that was neither warm nor cold, merely present, as if she were still deciding what category he deserved to occupy. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning, Deputy Ellsworth," she said. He stopped walking, which surprised him. "You can call me Marcus," he said. "Most people do." She considered this. "Then I will," she said, and went back to sweeping. He walked on, feeling obscurely as though he had won something small and not entirely understood. Over the following weeks, he found reasons to pass Nell Bright's store with a frequency that would have embarrassed him if he had examined it honestly. He bought coffee beans twice when he still had enough at home. He asked Nell's opinion on the price of lamp oil at unnecessary length. He accepted Nell's offer of a cup of tea on 3 separate occasions, sitting at the small table near the stove that Nell kept for the comfort of her regulars, while Irene moved quietly through the work of the store, stacking, recording, and sorting with a methodical efficiency that he found compelling in a way he could not fully explain. She was not a woman who filled silences for the sake of filling them. She spoke when she had something to say, and she listened when other people spoke with a quality of attention that was becoming increasingly rare in a town where everyone was always talking over the noise of the stockyards and the saloons. When Nell told a long story about a problematic delivery of calico fabric, Irene listened with genuine patience. When old Mr. Dennison came in to complain about the condition of the road east of town, Irene responded with specific, practical questions rather than empty sympathy. Marcus noticed all of this with the attentiveness of a man who had been trained to observe, and it only deepened the problem. He finally found a real reason to speak with her directly on a Wednesday evening in late May, when he heard raised voices coming from the alley behind the dry goods store during his night patrol. He came around the corner with his hand on his revolver and found Irene standing very still in the lantern light from the back door of the store, facing a man Marcus recognized as Clay Dorset, a transient cowhand who had come into town with a Texas herd and stayed behind when it moved on. Dorset was not violent by nature, but he was considerably drunk, and he was standing too close to Irene with the loose, swaying posture of a man who was not tracking the signals he was being given. "Ma'am," Marcus said, loudly enough to cut through the situation, and Dorset turned around and blinked. Irene's expression when she looked at Marcus was not relief exactly. It was something more composed than relief, but he could see the tension leaving her shoulders, and that was enough. He handled Dorset with the minimum of drama, walking the man firmly but without violence to the jail to sleep until morning, and when he came back past the alley, Irene was still there, sitting now on the back step with a shawl around her shoulders, looking at the dark sky above the rooflines. "You should go inside," Marcus said. "It is getting cold." "I know," she said. "I will in a moment." She paused. "Thank you." "It is the job," he said, and then felt immediately that this was the wrong answer, the kind of reflexive deflection that was a habit rather than a truth. She tilted her head slightly and looked at him. "Is that all it was?" she asked. He stood there in the alley with the cold May air moving around them and the distant noise of the saloons on the main street, and he said honestly, "No, not entirely." She nodded once, as if this confirmed something she had been working out for herself. "Then thank you for both things," she said, "for the job and for the other part." He left the alley smiling in a way he was glad no one on Kisham Street was awake to witness. Amos Garrett noticed the change in his deputy before Marcus was ready to acknowledge it openly. Garrett was 53, silver-haired, with eyes that had been watching people for 30 years and had learned to read the small shifts that preceded large ones. He said nothing for a while, which was Garrett's way, and then one morning in early June he handed Marcus a cup of coffee and said, without looking up from the papers on his desk, "Miss Vaughn seems like a steady sort." "She does," Marcus agreed carefully. "Nell Bright speaks well of her," Garrett continued. "Says she is reliable and has good sense." "Those are rarer than people suppose." "They are," Marcus said. Garrett finally looked up. His expression was the same one he used when he was waiting for a man to make up his mind about whether to be honest. "You planning to do something about that, or just walk past that store every morning until one of you goes gray?" Marcus drank his coffee without answering, which was answer enough, and Garrett went back to his papers with the small, private satisfaction of a man who already knew what was going to happen next. The problem, as Marcus came to understand it over the long, warm days of June, was not that he did not know what he wanted. The problem was that Irene Vaughn was not a woman who could be approached with the loose, easy confidence that the saloon girls or the visiting widow women seemed to respond to. She was not unfriendly. She was not cold. but she had a quality of self-containment that suggested she had constructed her independence deliberately, and at some cost, and Marcus was not the kind of man who could bring himself to knock against something carefully built without knowing whether he was being invited to. He learned more about her gradually, in the way you learn a landscape by moving across it rather than by studying a map. She had grown up in Wichita, the youngest daughter of a man who ran a small printing business. Her father had died 2 years ago, and her mother a year before that, leaving Irene at 23 with no family in Wichita she was close to, and a small inheritance that had lasted long enough for her to decide what she wanted to do next. She had come to Caldwell because Nell Bright was her mother's second cousin, and Nell had written offering work in a room, and Irene had accepted because Caldwell was different from Wichita and different was what she needed. He learned this not in a single conversation, but across half a dozen, in the spaces between other topics, the way you collect pieces of something without yet knowing what shape you are assembling. She told him about her father's press with a warmth that suggested she had loved him specifically and specifically missed him. She mentioned Wichita the way people mention places they have left with relief mixed with affection, the complicated relationship of someone who outgrew somewhere rather than escaping it. He told her about himself in return, with more honesty than he generally employed on the subject. He told her about his 3 departures from Caldwell, making no attempt to present them as part of a coherent plan, because they had not been. He told her about the surveying work, which he had genuinely loved for the part of it that involved moving through open country and understanding how land lay. He told her about Amos Garrett, and about Hector Bales, who was now a happy married man with 3 children and a thriving blacksmith operation on the east side of town. She listened to all of it with her complete attention, the way she listened to everything, and when he described turning Juniper around after 40 miles to come back and deal with the man who hurt Hector Bales, she said, "That does not sound like a man who could not make up his mind. It sounds like a man who keeps making the same decision for the same reason." "What reason is that?" he asked. "People," she said simply. He thought about that for several days afterward, turning it over the way you turn a coin to look at both sides. He had always framed his returns to Caldwell as failures of will, signs that he lacked the necessary determination to pull himself away and build something elsewhere. But the way Irene had said it made it sound like something different, like the returns were not weaknesses, but evidence of something he valued without having named it. The evening he decided to stop being careful about the whole situation arrived on a Thursday in the second week of July, when a minor miracle of timing placed both of them at the same spot on the Kishom Street boardwalk at the same hour of the evening, for no reason other than that they happened to be walking in the same direction. The sun was going down in the particular extravagant way that Kansas sunsets managed in the summer, spreading orange and deep rose across the enormous flat sky, and the day's heat was finally releasing itself into something approaching comfort. Irene had a book under her arm, borrowed from Mrs. Granger, who kept a small lending collection in the back of the millinery shop, and she was clearly heading for the bench outside the post office, where she sometimes sat in the evenings when the store was closed and Nell was visiting with friends. "May I walk with you?" Marcus asked, falling into step beside her. "You already are," she said, but the gray-green eyes were amused, which was progress. They walked to the bench and then, because the evening was fine and neither of them was in a hurry to be anywhere, they kept walking, past the post office and the livery and the closed butcher's shop and out to the edge of the town where the boardwalk ended and the dirt road opened up toward the flatlands. They stood at this edge in the sunset and watched the sky doing its extravagant best, and Marcus thought about what he wanted to say and how to say it, and then decided, in the way that sometimes happens, that the thinking was the obstacle. "Irene," he said. She turned to look at him, and the sunset was in her face, and her expression was open in the way it was only when she was not guarding herself against anything. "I know I have a reputation in this town for leaving," he said, And I'm not going to pretend that is not true because it is. But I want you to know that I have not thought about leaving once since April, not even in the way that a man thinks about a thing without meaning to." She was quiet for a moment. A mockingbird somewhere in the scrub was going through its evening repertoire, cycling through the calls of half a dozen other birds in a row. "That is quite a statement for a man who has packed his horse 3 times," she said. "I know it," he said. "I am making it anyway." The silence stretched between them, but it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind of silence that has weight and texture. That means something is being considered seriously. "I have not been in a hurry to trust anyone new," Irene said at last, quietly. "Since my father died, I have been learning how to be a person who does not need anyone in particular. It has been useful. But it is also lonely, and I am tired of pretending it is not." He did not move toward her or reach for her hand, though he wanted to do both. He just said, "I am not asking you to stop being someone who does not need anyone. I am asking if you would want company anyway." The mockingbird switched to the call of a meadowlark, bright and liquid against the fading sky. "Yes," Irene said. "I think I would." The summer of 1883 was warm and dry and full of the kind of ordinary daily life that, when you are falling in love with someone, becomes lit from within like a lantern in a window. Marcus learned the particular way Irene moved through a day, which was purposefully and without wasted motion, but with a capacity for sudden stillness when something caught her genuine interest. A book, a view, a conversation that had taken an unexpected turn. He learned that she had strong opinions about the proper way to make coffee and was not reluctant to share them. He learned that she was quietly funny in a way that caught you off guard, because her humor arrived sideways rather than announced. She learned him too, with the same attentive thoroughness she brought to anything she decided was worth understanding. She learned that he was better with people in one-on-one situations than in groups, that he thought through problems by moving around rather than sitting still, and that he had a habit of starting sentences about himself that he then redirected away from at the last moment, a deflection she gently but persistently refused to accept. "You were going to say something else," she told him one evening in late July when they were sitting on the porch of Nell Bright's store after closing, the air still and warm and full of the sound of crickets. "I changed my mind," he said. "I noticed," she said. "You do that frequently. You start to say something honest and then you substitute something safer." He looked at her. "You are very observant for a woman I have known 3 months. You are very obvious for a man who has been a lawman for several years," she returned. He laughed, genuinely and with surprise, because she had timed it perfectly. And she smiled at him with the full, unguarded version of her smile that he had only seen a handful of times, the one that reached all the way to the gray-green eyes and stayed there. "I was going to say," he said, because she had earned the honesty, "that every time I had left Caldwell before, there was some feeling underneath it that the town owed me something it was not delivering, like I was supposed to be somewhere else and Caldwell was a delay. But when I think about being somewhere else now, it is not like that anymore. Anywhere else just seems like it is missing the relevant part." She did not answer for a moment. The night was full of its sounds, the horses in the livery, the distant talk from the saloons, the crickets in the dry grass behind the buildings. "The relevant part," she said quietly. "Is that me?" "Yes," he said. "That is you." She reached across the small space between their chairs and put her hand on his, just resting it there with the simple directness that was so entirely her, and he turned his palm up and held it. August arrived, and with it, a heat that made the air above the stockyards shimmer and the cattle restless in their pens. Marcus spent long days in the dust and noise, managing the complications that arose when tired cowboys and untried cattle shared a confined space, and Irene spent long days in the relative cool of Nell's store, which at least had the benefit of shade and a decent cross breeze through the back window. They met in the evenings when the day's temperature released, walking the edge of the town in the long summer dusk, sitting on the bench outside the post office, occasionally joining Nell and Hector Bales and his wife Ruth for supper at the Bales house on a Sunday. Hector Bales took an immediate and enthusiastic liking to Irene, which Marcus had half expected. Hector was the kind of man who liked anyone who was direct and capable, and Irene was both. He also, Marcus noticed with some amusement, took it upon himself to provide a kind of informal endorsement of Marcus's character in Irene's presence at every available opportunity, which Marcus found alternately touching and embarrassing. "He came back 40 miles, you understand," Hector said to Irene at the Sunday supper in August, gesturing at Marcus with his fork. 40 miles. Just turned around and came back. Most men would have said it was someone else's problem. "I know the story," Irene said pleasantly. "I am just saying," Hector said. "Hector," Marcus said. "I am just saying the man has integrity," Hector said, entirely unapologetic. "Some women want to know these things." Ruth Bales met Irene's eyes across the table with an expression of long-suffering spousal solidarity, and Irene pressed her lips together to contain what was clearly genuine amusement. And Marcus looked at both of them and thought that this right here, this particular table with these particular people on a warm August Sunday, was the thing he had been circling all his life without knowing it. There was a complication in September, which Marcus supposed was inevitable, because nothing in Caldwell was ever entirely straightforward. A man named Everett Crane arrived from Wichita in the second week of September, riding a good horse and wearing the clean clothes of a businessman. He was 30 years old, with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to being well received, and he took a room at the Caldwell Hotel and spent 2 days in town before Marcus discovered, through the ordinary workings of a small town's information network, that Crane had come specifically because of Irene Vaughn. Marcus learned the full story from Irene herself, which was how he preferred to learn things, and she told it to him plainly, sitting at Nell's back table with 2 cups of coffee, while the September wind moved through the alley outside, and Nell found reasons to be in the front of the store. Everett Crane was the son of a Wichita businessman who had been her father's business partner. After her father's death, Crane had expressed an interest in a formal courtship. Irene had not encouraged this interest. Crane had persisted. Irene had eventually left Wichita partly to avoid an ongoing situation she found tiresome and somewhat presumptuous. She said all of this without drama or particular heat, the way you describe a weather pattern rather than a catastrophe. "He followed you here," Marcus said. "Apparently," she said. "I imagine his father put him up to it. My father left part of the printing business to me, which I sold when I came here. It was not an enormous sum, but I suspect the Crane family would have preferred it to remain in their orbit through the convenient mechanism of a marriage. You did not want to marry him." "I did not," she said without hesitation. "He is not a bad man. He is simply a man who is very accustomed to things going his way, and he interpreted my disinclination as something that could be overcome with continued application." Marcus looked at his coffee. "And now he is here." "He is here," she agreed. She looked at him steadily. "I am not uncertain about what I want, Marcus. I want you to know that." "I know it," he said. "But I think I need to speak with him directly," she said. "I was never unkind in Wichita, but I may not have been as clear as I could have been. I would rather resolve it properly than have it hanging in the air." He respected this. He would have offered to be present and she would have declined, so he did not offer. He simply said, "If you need me, I am available." She met with Everett Crane the following afternoon, in Nell Bright's store with Nell present as a chaperone, which was both proper for the time and entirely practical. Marcus did not find out what was said, but Crane left the Caldwell Hotel the morning after, settling his bill and riding north toward Wichita without speaking to anyone else in town. Irene never gave Marcus a verbatim account, and he never pushed for one. He only asked the next evening on their walk whether it was resolved. "It is resolved," she said. "Good," he said. He was surprised, she said after a moment with a thoughtful tone. I think he genuinely did not understand in Wichita that I meant what I said. He thought I was performing a kind of modesty that was waiting to be overcome. It was useful to explain to him that this was not the case. How did he take it? Badly at first, she said honestly. And then, I think, with something like relief. He has been pursuing this for over a year because his father wanted him to, and I think part of him was tired of it. People often pursue things they do not actually want, Marcus said. She looked at him. Is that what you have been doing? With Caldwell? He thought about it seriously because she deserved serious thought. I think I was pursuing the idea of somewhere else because I thought it was what a man with ambition was supposed to want, he said. Not because I actually wanted to be in Abilene or on the surveying crew or anywhere in particular that was not here. And now I know the difference, he said, between wanting a thing and thinking you are supposed to want a thing. She slipped her hand into the crook of his arm as they walked, a gesture that had become natural and comfortable between them over the summer, and he covered her hand with his, and the October air came down cool from the north, and the big Kansas sky overhead was full of stars from horizon to horizon. October in Caldwell was the beginning of the long winding down. The last of the Texas herds had come through, and the stockyards were quieting, and the cowboys who stayed were the ones who would winter here or find work on the local ranches. The town settled into its autumn version of itself, smaller and slower, and in some ways more honest, the seasonal transients stripped away to leave the people who actually lived there. Marcus and Irene had their first real argument in October, which Marcus later came to view as an important milestone, the moment at which the thing between them stopped being new and tentative and became something more durable and real. It started with a piece of information that Marcus received in his official capacity and struggled with in his personal one. A man named Tolliver, who ran a small freighting operation out of a yard near the stockyards, was systematically underpaying his workers, several of whom were recent arrivals with limited options. This was not, strictly speaking, a criminal matter, but when Irene discovered it through one of Nell's regular customers who was married to one of the underpaid men, she came to Marcus with the clear expectation that he would do something about it. It is not against any law I can enforce, Marcus said. It is wrong, she said. I know it is wrong, he said, with more patience than he felt. But Amos Garrett and I cannot arrest a man for paying low wages. The law does not cover it. Then use your influence, she said. You are a known figure in this town. If you spoke to Tolliver, speaking to Tolliver will accomplish nothing except making an enemy of a man who employs several people and has connections with the stockyard operators, Marcus said. And creating enemies in this job is a practical problem, not just a personal one. She looked at him with the particular expression she wore when she thought someone was choosing practicality over principle, which was not a comfortable expression to be on the receiving end of. So the answer is to do nothing. The answer, he said, is that some problems do not have a law to solve them, and pretending otherwise does not help the men who are being underpaid. And what helps them? She asked. He did not have a good answer for that, and the honest silence where the answer should have been was more effective than anything she could have said. She left the marshal's office with her back straight and her chin up, which was how Irene Vaughn looked when she was genuinely angry rather than merely irritated, and Marcus sat with the conversation for the rest of the afternoon, with the uncomfortable feeling of a man who has been technically correct and morally insufficient at the same time. He thought about it overnight, and in the morning he went to see Garrett and laid the situation out plainly. Garrett listened, as he always did, with complete attention, and then he said, "There is nothing illegal, but there is something we could do." What they did was informal and somewhat creative by the standards of law enforcement, but it was effective. Garrett spoke to two of the stockyard operators, men he had known for years, about the fact that Tolliver's yard was becoming a subject of public conversation in ways that could complicate the general business atmosphere of the town. Garrett did not threaten or accuse. He simply introduced the concept of inconvenient visibility. The stockyard operators, who had leverage over Tolliver through the contracts they gave his freighting operation, had a conversation with Tolliver shortly afterward. Within 2 weeks, the wages had been adjusted to something approaching fair. Marcus told Irene about this, not because he needed credit but because he thought she deserved to know that the argument had mattered and that the discomfort of it had produced something useful. She listened to the whole account, and when he finished she said, "Garrett is a more resourceful man than I gave him credit for." "He is," Marcus agreed, "though I want to be clear that this was not purely his idea." "I know," she said. "I could tell by the way you described it." She paused. "I was not entirely fair to you in that conversation. I know you cannot wave a badge and make all inequities illegal." "You were fair enough," he said. "The question you asked was the right one. What helps them?" "I needed to think about that more seriously." She looked at him with the warmth in her eyes that she kept at a general low level and turned up only occasionally, like a lamp being adjusted. "You are very good at admitting when you need to think about something more seriously," she said. "That is rarer than it ought to be." "Is that a compliment?" he asked. "It is several compliments at once," she said. "You will just have to accept them all together." November came with cold winds and a hard frost that killed the last of the season's wildflowers and turned the grass along the cattle roads a pale gold. Nell Bright's store was warm with the stove going, and the social life of Caldwell contracted toward its indoor winter version. Suppers and card evenings and the church social circuit, which Marcus attended with a dutifulness he had never quite felt before Irene made it worthwhile to sit through. He had been thinking about asking her to marry him since September, which he recognized with some amusement as a shorter timeline than most people would consider deliberate. But he had been watching Irene for months with the attention he brought to anything he was trying to understand, and he had arrived at the conclusion that the length of time a person had known someone was not, in fact, the best indicator of whether they knew them well. He had known the landscape between Caldwell and Abilene for years and still managed to make bad decisions about it. He had known Irene Vaughn for 7 months and understood her with a clarity and certainty he had never felt about another person. He asked Amos Garrett's opinion, which he did on important matters, as a check on his own thinking. "You have known her since April," Garrett said. "I know," Marcus said. 7 months is not a long time," Garrett said. "I know that too," Marcus said. Garrett was quiet for a moment. "But you have been around each other nearly every day in those 7 months," he said. "That is not the same as a 7-month acquaintance where you see someone once a week at a church social. You know what she is like in difficulty and in ordinary circumstance, and when she is right and when she thinks she is right and is not." "I do," Marcus said. "Then what are you asking me for?" Garrett said. Marcus considered this. "I suppose I am asking because I have been wrong before about being certain of things," he said. "Wrong about what specifically?" Garrett asked. "About leaving Caldwell," Marcus said. 3 times I was certain I was ready to go. 3 times I was not." Garrett set down his pen and gave Marcus the full benefit of his attention, which was something he did only when the conversation was important. "Those 3 times," he said, "you left because you thought you were supposed to want something else, not because you truly wanted it. You said so yourself in approximately those words last summer." He paused. "Is this the same kind of thing? Are you asking Irene Vaughn to marry you because you think you are supposed to, or because you want to?" The answer was simple. "Because I want to," Marcus said. "There is no should about it. There is just that this is the life I want, and she is the center of it." "Then you do not need my opinion," Garrett said, and picked up his pen again. Marcus proposed to Irene on a Sunday evening in early November, sitting on the steps of Nell Bright's store after supper with the stars overhead and the cold air smelling of wood smoke from half a dozen chimney stacks. He did not make a speech. He told her that he had been wrong to think of his returns to Caldwell as failures, because every return had been toward something real, and the thing that made this town worth returning to had changed over the years until it had arrived at its current, specific, irreplaceable form. He told her that he could not promise to be a simple man or an easy one, but that he could promise to be honest with her and to choose her with the same conviction he had developed over the course of 7 months about what he actually wanted as opposed to what he thought he was supposed to want. He had a ring. He had ridden to Wichita on his day off 2 weeks earlier and purchased it from a jeweler there. A simple gold band with a small garnet set in it, because garnet was red like the Kansas sunset, and he was perhaps a more sentimental man than he generally let on. Irene looked at the ring in the lamplight that fell from the store's front window, and then she looked at him, and her face was the most fully open he had ever seen it, all the careful self-containment set aside for a moment so that what was underneath could show through. "I told myself in Wichita that I would not build anything around another person," she said, "that I would make myself entirely independent and not need anyone and be free." She paused. "And then I came to Caldwell and met a man who packs his horse 3 times and comes back every time, and I thought, well, perhaps the goal is not to need no one. Perhaps the goal is to choose the right person to need. Is that a yes?" He asked, though he already knew. "That is very emphatically a yes," she said, and held out her hand. He put the ring on her finger and she looked at it in the lamplight, turning her hand slightly, and then she leaned across the small space between them and kissed him, and the cold November air wrapped around them both and the stars were enormous overhead, and Marcus Ellsworth felt, for the first time in his adult life, the uncomplicated and total certainty of being exactly where he was supposed to be. They were married in December of 1883 in the Caldwell Methodist Church, on a Saturday morning when the sky was white with high clouds and the ground was frozen, and the whole town seemed to have turned out, because in a town of Caldwell's size, a wedding was an event of some collective significance. Nell Bright sat in the front row and wept with a happiness that she made no attempt to conceal. Hector Bales served as Marcus's witness with visible pride, and Ruth Bales fussed pleasantly over Irene's dress, a blue wool gown that was not elaborate but was exactly right for Irene, who wore clothes the way she did everything else, with practicality elevated to a kind of elegance by the force of her own personality. Amos Garrett sat near the back, as befitted a man who considered himself a quiet presence at most events, but Marcus caught his eye during the ceremony, and Garrett gave him the small, slow nod of a man confirming that things have gone as they should. The ceremony itself was simple and honest, which was the only kind of ceremony that would have suited either of them. They said the words in the clear voices of people who meant them, and the minister, a kind-faced man named Reverend Holloway who had been in Caldwell since the cattle drive days, gave a brief and thoughtful address about the particular kind of courage involved in making a permanent commitment in a world that was largely impermanent, which Marcus thought was the most accurate description of marriage he had ever heard. Afterward, there was a dinner at the Bales' house, crowded and warm and full of the particular noise of people who are genuinely happy in each other's company. Food covered every available surface. Old Owen Tate from the Silver Spur, who had long since sold the saloon and now ran a quieter business selling grain, made a toast that recalled the 22-year-old Marcus Ellsworth who had sat at his bar and announced that Caldwell was too small for a man with ambition. The room laughed. Marcus shook his head. Irene, sitting beside him, took his hand under the table. "Were you embarrassed?" she asked quietly, close to his ear. "Only appropriately," he said. "You were trying to figure out what you wanted," she said. "That is not embarrassing, that is just being young." "I was 22, he said. "That is not so young." "It is young enough," she said, and pressed his hand, and he looked at her profile in the warm lamplight of the Bales' dining room and thought that the 22-year-old version of himself, restless and certain and wrong about almost everything that mattered, could not have imagined this moment, and was better off for not knowing it was coming, because part of the value of arriving somewhere unexpected was the surprise. They spent their first winter as a married couple in Marcus's rooms above the hardware store, which were not large, but which Irene organized with the efficiency of a woman who had long experience in making limited space work well. She brought her books and her mother's quilt and a green ceramic teapot that had been in the family since she was a child. And these things, combined with Marcus's few possessions, his surveying maps pinned to the wall above the desk, and the good Winchester rifle on its rack by the door, and the photograph of his father on the shelf above the stove, composed a life that felt complete in the way that spaces feel complete when they are lived in honestly rather than decorated. She continued working for Nell through that winter, partly because the income was useful, and partly because she and Nell had developed a genuine and affectionate partnership that neither of them wanted to interrupt. Marcus continued as Garrett's deputy through the quieter winter months, and the days had a routine that was ordinary in the best possible sense, shaped by the specific textures of Caldwell in winter, the cold mornings and the warm stoves, and the short days that ended early with the sky turning dark purple and orange above the flat western horizon. They talked, which perhaps sounds small but was not. They were both people who used words carefully, which meant the conversations they had were precise and interesting, and often led somewhere neither of them had planned to go. They argued sometimes, in the productive way of two opinionated people who respect each other, and they always arrived eventually at either agreement or a settled acknowledgement of genuine difference, which was almost better than agreement because it required them to know each other accurately rather than simply mirroring each other. Marcus told Irene things he had not told anyone. About the surveying work and what it had felt like to ride through open country with the specific pleasure of measuring and recording it, of making the unmarked land legible. About his father, who had been a difficult and loving and imperfect man, the kind of father who taught you to work hard and forgot sometimes to say he was proud. About the quality of loneliness that had settled into the edges of his years in Caldwell between the ages of 22 and 28. Not dramatic loneliness, but the low, persistent kind that you get used to without noticing how used to it you have become. Irene told him about her own version of the same loneliness, the Wichita years after her parents died when she had learned to be competent and self-sufficient as a necessity, and then found that competence and self-sufficiency, while genuinely valuable, did not actually address the particular hunger that human company fills. She told him about her mother, who had been a reader and a practical joker, and had died too young of a fever that should not have been fatal, and Marcus recognized in the way Irene talked about her the same specific grief he felt about his own father, the kind where you miss not just the person but all the future conversations you will never get to have. Spring came slowly to Caldwell in 1884, the frost releasing its grip in degrees, the grass along the creek bottoms turning green first and then spreading outward across the flatlands. The cattle drives would start coming through again in May, and the town was preparing itself for the seasonal transformation from its quiet winter self to its louder, more populated, more complicated summer version. In March, Irene told Marcus she was expecting a child. She told him in the morning, before either of them had left for work, standing in the kitchen of their rooms with the light coming gray and cold through the east window and a cup of tea warming her hands. She said it plainly, as she said most things, and watched his face. His face did what he was fairly certain was obvious to anyone in the room, which was that it broke into a smile of such unpracticed size that he felt briefly self-conscious about it. He crossed the kitchen and took her face in both his hands and said, without the deflection or substitution of anything safer, "I am so glad. I am so entirely glad." She put her hands over his and her smile came up slow and warm and unguarded, the full version, the one that reached the gray-green eyes and stayed there. "I thought you might be," she said. "Is it obvious?" he asked. "It is obvious that you are a man for whom people matter above almost everything else," she said. "It is not much of a leap from there to knowing how you would feel about this." Amos Garrett was the first person outside the couple to know, because Marcus told him that same day with the poorly suppressed radiance of a man who is incapable in that moment of appearing casual about anything. Garrett received the news with a warmth that was all the more moving for being quiet, reaching across the desk to shake Marcus's hand with both of his, which was something he had done perhaps 3 times in the years Marcus had known him. Nell Bright knew by the end of the day, because Irene told her, and Nell's response was significantly less quiet than Garrett's. It involved a considerable amount of embracing and some happy crying, and the immediate production of tea, and the discussion of several pressing practical matters relating to infant clothing and appropriate dietary precautions, all of which Irene received with the tolerant affection of a woman who understood that Nell's enthusiasm was a form of love. Hector Bales declared upon hearing the news that he had known it was going to happen since the moment he met Irene, which was not true, but was so characteristically Hector that everyone let it stand. The spring and summer of 1884 moved through their seasons with the particular quality that time has when you are waiting for something that is not an ordinary event. Marcus found himself increasingly attentive to the safety aspects of his work, not because he had been careless before, but because the stakes felt newly and specifically weighted. He also found himself reading more. He had always read, but now he read with a purposefulness that had the flavor of preparation, going through the books on surveying and land management that he had accumulated over the years and thinking about what might constitute, for a man who had a wife and a coming child, a more stable form of livelihood than a deputy's wages. He talked to Irene about this, because he talked to Irene about things that mattered, and she had opinions which she expressed directly. "You loved the surveying work," she said. "You have said so more than once. The crew work has dried up," he said. "Independent surveying has not," she said. "There is more land being settled and parceled in this territory every year. Someone needs to do that work. There is no reason it could not be you. Setting up an independent practice takes time and capital," he said. "We have both," she said, with the calm of a woman who has done the sums. He looked at her. "You are thinking about your inheritance." "I am thinking about what it is for," she said. "I did not keep it sitting in a bank in Wichita because I intended to leave it sitting in a bank forever. I kept it because I had not found a use for it that made sense." She paused. Starting a land surveying practice for a man with 2 years of professional field experience in a county that is actively expanding its settled acreage makes sense. Marcus thought about it for 3 days, which was about 2.5 days longer than he probably needed. The logic was sound. The timing was forward-looking in a way that felt different from the impulsive departures of his 20s, different because it was rooted in a specific place and a specific future rather than a vague idea of somewhere else. He spoke to Garrett about it because Garrett deserved the conversation. "I had been wondering when you would get to this," Garrett said. "To what?" Marcus said. "To the next thing," Garrett said. "You have always been a man with more in him than this job requires. I have been glad to have you, but I have never been under any illusion that I would have you forever." "I could continue as deputy while establishing the practice," Marcus said. "I would appreciate it," Garrett said. "Give me time to find someone adequate. Finding someone good will take longer, but I can work with adequate for a while." Marcus shook Garrett's hand and felt the particular emotion of a man who is changing a significant thing in his life, and is grateful that the thing he is changing it from was good. He applied for certification through the county surveyor's office in Wichita in July, completing the required additional examination with the easy confidence of someone who has actually done the work and not merely studied it. The certification came back in August, and Marcus Ellsworth, licensed surveyor, began receiving his first independent clients in the same month, small parcels and boundary disputes, and plat confirmations for farmers and small ranchers in the surrounding county. The baby came in October of 1884, on a Thursday night when the wind was out of the north, and the first real cold of autumn had settled into the town. Irene had insisted on staying working in the store until 2 weeks prior, over Nell's clucking objection, and with Marcus's carefully non-expressed anxiety, and then had spent those final 2 weeks at home in a state of purposeful preparation that he recognized as her particular form of patience under pressure. The baby was a boy, healthy and loud, with a quantity of dark hair that surprised the midwife, and a pair of lungs that surprised no one who knew either of his parents. They named him James, after both of their fathers, which seemed right in the way that things seem right when they honor what came before without requiring you to be less than yourself. Marcus held his son for the first time in the warm lamplight of their bedroom, with Irene watching from the bed with the quiet, exhausted, absolute gaze of a woman who has just done something enormous, and the baby's small weight against his chest was one of the most specific and complete feelings he had ever experienced. He looked at Irene and said, "Thank you," and she knew, because she always knew the precise register of what he was saying, that he did not mean only for this particular night. Caldwell in the winter of 1884 and into 1885 was a town settling into a new kind of itself. The cattle drive era was genuinely winding down as the railroads pushed deeper into Texas, and the need to trail herds all the way to Kansas faded. The wild quality of the town, which had been real enough in its peak years, was softening into something more domestic and permanent. Families were building houses. Churches were expanding. The school, which had operated from a single room, was discussing a second. Marcus's surveying practice grew steadily through that first year, with work coming in from farms being formally divided among inheriting children, and from new settlers needing parcel boundaries established, and from the county itself, which needed accurate records of the land being incorporated into its formal jurisdiction. He hired a young man named Cornelius Pate, 19 years old and quick with figures, to help with the record keeping, and the office he rented on Kisham Street acquired the comfortable disorder of a place where real work was done. Irene, 6 months after James was born, went back to helping Nell 3 days a week, bringing the baby with her in the manner of practical women throughout history who have declined to treat the existence of children as a reason to stop doing things. Nell was delighted to have them both. James, in the way of infants who are carried everywhere and introduced to large quantities of adult company, developed an early sociability that made him an effective fixture in the store, looked at and commented upon by customers with the universal approval that small babies attract. The years that followed were years of building, in the specific and satisfying sense of the word that means watching something take shape out of persistent effort. Marcus's practice continued to grow. He took on more county work, and eventually was appointed as an official deputy county surveyor, which was a salaried position in addition to his private work, and represented a degree of professional establishment he had not quite imagined for himself when he was 22 and riding toward Abilene with nothing particular in his saddlebag, except ambition without direction. He had formally left the marshal's office in the spring of 1885, and Garrett had found a decent replacement, a younger man from Dodge City who was competent if not remarkable, and Marcus had watched Garrett settle comfortably into the professional distance that comes when you are no longer responsible for the daily work of something you built. Irene, in the spring of 1886, told Marcus she was expecting their second child. She told him in the kitchen again, morning light tea in her hands, and his face did the same unpracticed thing it had done the first time. "You are entirely predictable on this subject," she said, smiling. "I know," he said. "I make no apology for it." The second child was a girl, born in December of 1886 on a cold, clear day when the sky above Caldwell was the deep particular blue that only comes in December. They named her Clara, after Irene's mother, and she arrived with the same dark hair as her brother, but with her mother's gray-green eyes, which Marcus noticed with a particular pleasure he took no pains to conceal. James, 2 years old when Clara was born, treated his sister with the combination of possessive affection and occasional bewilderment that small children bring to the arrival of siblings. He was a vocal child, with strong opinions about everything and the words to express them, which his parents received with the equal parts exhaustion and delight that parenthood routinely produces. By 1887, Marcus and Irene had saved enough from the combined income of the surveying practice and Irene's continued work with Nell, now a formal salary rather than room and board, to purchase a proper house on the east side of Caldwell. It was not large, but it had a good porch and a substantial kitchen, and a study for Marcus's maps and surveying records, and a room that Irene immediately claimed for a small personal library that grew by a book or two every month from whatever she could order through the general store or bring back from occasional trips to Wichita. Moving into the house was a Saturday in April, and half the town seemed to appear to help, because that was the nature of Caldwell in its more settled years, a community that turned out for the practical work of each other's lives without requiring an invitation. Hector Bales lifted furniture with the enthusiasm of a much younger man. Ruth Bales organized the kitchen with a thoroughness that made Irene's eyes widen slightly. Nell Bright brought food. Amos Garrett brought a bottle of good whiskey and sat on the porch with Marcus in the evening when the work was done and the children were asleep inside, and the spring air was soft and full of the smell of new grass. 3 times you left, Garrett said, with the comfortable simplicity of a man revisiting something he has thought about with pleasure. 3 times, Marcus agreed. And you are still here, Garrett said. I am still here, Marcus said. Garrett poured 2 glasses. Was it worth it, all the leaving and coming back? Marcus looked at the light in the windows of the house, where Irene was moving inside, visible in profile through the glass, putting things in order with the specific grace of a woman in a space that is genuinely hers. He looked at the porch boards under his feet, solid and level. He heard faintly from inside the sound of James talking to himself in the high, earnest monologue of a 3-year-old narrating his own experience, and the smaller answering sounds of Clara. Yes, he said. Though I would say it differently now, it was not the leaving that was worth it. It was arriving. Garrett drank his whiskey and looked at the darkening April sky and said nothing, which meant he agreed. In 1888, Amos Garrett retired from the marshal's office, citing his knees and the winter cold, and the town gave him a dinner at which Marcus spoke, with genuine feeling and the particular honesty that Irene had long since made habitual in him, about what it meant to work for a man who was consistently better at being right than he was at being impressive, and who had the uncommon wisdom to know the difference. Garrett received this speech with the composed, slightly exasperated dignity of a man who does not enjoy being praised, but can recognize when it is being done sincerely. After the dinner, walking home in the warm summer night with Irene beside him and James trotting ahead of them on the boardwalk and Clara asleep on Marcus's shoulder, Irene said, "That was the best speech I have ever heard you give." "Because I meant it," he said. "You always mean what you say," she said. "But that one you meant more than usual." He thought about this. "He was the first person who treated me like a man worth the job he had been given," Marcus said. "Before Garrett, I had bosses who were fine, but nobody who looked at me and saw something specific rather than a set of available skills. He saw something specific." "What did he see?" she asked. "I think he saw someone who cared about people," Marcus said, "and thought that was worth keeping around." Irene took his free hand, the one that was not holding Clara, and walked quietly beside him under the Caldwell stars. "He was right," she said. The surveying practice in its later years, as Caldwell settled into its identity as a small but stable agricultural and trade town, became something Marcus had not quite anticipated, which was a record of the land itself. The maps he produced and accumulated over the years represented the county in a level of detail that became genuinely historical. Documents of what the land had been before fences and roads and formal ownership transformed the open range into something parceled and named. He kept the original maps on the wall of his study, charting the expansion of settlement in a visual way that James, at 6 and then 7 and then 8 years old, spent long hours staring at with the focused attention of a child who has inherited a parent's particular relationship with space and distance. It was James who first asked at the age of 7 about the 3 times his father had left Caldwell. He had overheard something, the way children always overhear the things adults discuss in what they believe is sufficient distance, and he came to Marcus in the study one Saturday morning with the direct inquiry of a child who has decided something needs explaining. "Did you want to leave?" James asked. "Or did you just go?" Marcus looked at his son, who had his mother's gray-green eyes despite the dark hair, and was 7 years old and earnest with the weight of a question he was not quite sure he was asking correctly. "Both," Marcus said honestly. "The first time I went because I thought I should. The second time I came back because someone needed me. The third time I went because I was trying to become something I was not sure how to be. And then I came back because I was out of other options, and this time I stayed." "Why?" James asked. "Because I met your mother," Marcus said. James considered this with the gravity of a 7-year-old evaluating a complex argument. "And before that you did not know what you wanted to do." "I knew what I was supposed to want," Marcus said. "That is a different thing." James took this in. He looked at the maps on the wall, at the lines and marks that represented land measured and recorded by his father's hands. "I know what I want to do," he said, with the straightforward confidence of a child who has not yet learned to doubt his own clarity. "What is that?" Marcus asked. "I want to go on the railroad and see all the places on the maps," James said. "That is a fine ambition," Marcus said. "And then come back," James added, with the practical afterthought of a child who has grown up in a house where leaving and returning are not failures but rhythms, "to tell you and Mama about it." Marcus looked at his son for a long moment, at the earnest face and the direct eyes and the unself-conscious certainty, and felt something that had no better name than rightness, the particular settling sensation of a man who can see clearly from where he stands. "That sounds exactly right," he said. The 1880s turned into the 1890s with the gradual, almost imperceptible way that decades change in small towns, through the accumulation of small differences that you only notice when you compare the present to a point far enough back. Caldwell was less wild and more permanent. The Silver Spur had become a respectable dining establishment under new ownership. The school had its second room and was discussing a third. The street that had been dirt and noise during the cattle drive years was quieter now, and the quietness had its own quality, the sound of a place that has decided what it wants to be. Marcus was 38 in 1893, and Irene was 34, and their life had the texture of something genuinely built. The house on the east side was fully theirs, paid for and shaped by years of living. James was 9 and Clara was 6, and both of them had the ease of children who have grown up in a home where they were seen and taken seriously, who understood that the adults in their lives meant what they said. In the spring of 1893, Irene told Marcus for the third time that they were expecting. She told him in the kitchen morning tea, and his face did exactly what it had done twice before, and she laughed this time, a full and genuine laugh. "You will never be predictable in the ways you intend to be," she said, "and entirely predictable in the ways you do not intend to be. I have accepted this about you." "It is a considerable failing," he said. "It is a considerable virtue," she said. "Only a man who genuinely means things is predictable about meaning them." The third child was a boy, born in November of 1893 during a heavy rain that drummed on the roof of the house and turned the street outside into mud. They named him Samuel, which was a name that had been in Marcus's family and which he had been carrying in reserve without telling Irene, and when he suggested it she looked at him with the warm, specific expression she reserved for the moments when he revealed something he had been quietly holding. "Samuel," she said, trying it. "Yes, that fits." "You were not planning to argue about it?" he asked. "I always plan to argue about things," she said. "I reserve the right to change my mind when the argument is unnecessary." Nell Bright died in the spring of 1894, quietly in her sleep, in the room above her store where she had lived since her husband passed. She was 67 and had been failing slowly since the previous winter, and her death was not a shock, but it was a grief. She had been, in every practical sense, the person who made Irene's arrival in Caldwell possible, and she had been present at every significant event of Marcus and Irene's life together, with the particular quality of someone who loves you specifically, and not merely as a general category of people to be fond of. She left the dry goods store to Irene, which surprised the town and did not surprise Marcus at all, because Nell Bright had been a woman who knew her own mind about where things should go. Irene stood in the store the day after the will was read and looked at the space she had learned to know from the inside and out, the shelves she had restocked, and the ledger she had kept, and the counter where she had stood on the morning Marcus Ellsworth had walked through the door with his hat in his hand and a feed order to collect. "What will you do?" Marcus asked her. "Run the store," she said simply. "Nell built something real here. It would be a waste to let it go." She turned to look at him. "With some differences. I have some ideas." The ideas were good, as Irene's ideas generally were. She expanded the stock of books and writing materials, recognizing that Caldwell was becoming a town of families who read rather than a town of transient cowboys who drank, and she negotiated a more reliable supply arrangement with a Wichita wholesaler and brought in a young woman named Ada Price to help with the counter work, giving Ada the same arrangement Nell had once given Irene: work and a fair wage in exchange for honest effort. The store under Irene's ownership became a different kind of place than it had been, more than a dry goods supplier, a kind of quiet center of the town's domestic life, where women gathered to talk and exchange information, and occasionally to sit at the back table with a cup of coffee and read a few pages of whatever was new on the shelf. Marcus walked past it in the morning on his way to the surveying office and felt the deep, uncomplicated satisfaction of watching something he loved do well in the world. James turned 15 in the fall of 1899, and by then he was tall enough to look his father in the eye, with his mother's directness and his father's patience, and a combination of both of their humor that had been producing excellent surprises for several years. Clara was 13 and had decided, with the clarity of a girl who knew her own mind, that she wanted to study medicine, which was not the most conventional ambition for a girl in Caldwell, but which her parents received with the serious consideration it deserved. Samuel was 6 and appeared to have inherited Marcus's spatial intelligence and Irene's capacity for intensity, and was already drawing maps of the house and the yard with an accuracy that Cornelius Pate, who had been with the surveying practice for 15 years by then, regarded with professional appreciation. Marcus at 44 and Irene at 40 were people who had the look of a long and specific happiness, not the smooth happiness of people who had never faced anything difficult, but the kind that has lines in it from weather and work and grief, and all the ordinary, extraordinary things that a life together accumulates. They still walked in the evenings when the work was done, and the children were settled, still talked the way they had always talked, with the full mutual attention of two people who had never stopped finding each other worth listening to. One evening in the October of 1899, walking the familiar route that had not changed much since those first uncertain evenings of 1883, out past the post office and toward the edge of town, where the dirt road opened up toward the flatlands, Irene stopped walking and stood looking west at the sunset. It was one of the big extravagant Kansas sunsets, orange and deep rose and a thin line of gold at the very edge of the horizon, the kind that spread across the enormous flat sky with the confidence of something that knows it is remarkable. The grass of the flatlands caught the light and went gold, and the distant line of cottonwoods along the creek stood black and fine against the color, and the air was cold and clean and smelled of autumn. "Do you remember," Irene said, "the first time we walked out here?" "July of 1883, Marcus said. "You had a book under your arm." And you were trying to think of how to say what you wanted to say, she said. I gave up thinking and just said it, he said. I know, she said. It was the right decision. She was quiet for a moment. I have been thinking recently about how different things might have been. If Nell had not written to me, if I had not come, if you had been out of town when I arrived, or if the first impression had gone differently, or if 100 small things had fallen otherwise. That kind of thinking leads to considerable vertigo, Marcus said. I know, she said. But I think it from time to time anyway, because it makes me understand more clearly what it means that it went the way it did instead of the other way. She turned to look at him, and the sunset was in her face, and she was 40 years old and beautiful in the specific way of people who have lived fully and honestly, her gray-green eyes clear and direct in the fading light. Marcus, she said. Yes, he said. I am glad you kept coming back, she said. To this town, all 3 times, because if you had stayed gone, you would not have been here. He looked at her for a moment, at the face he had been looking at for 16 years, and which had become as familiar as the landscape of the county he had measured and mapped, familiar not in the way of things worn out by repetition, but in the way of things so thoroughly known that the knowing itself has become a kind of love. I did not come back for the town, he said, but I am glad I did. She stepped toward him, and he put his arms around her, and they stood at the edge of Caldwell with the Kansas sunset behind them, on the same ground where they had stood as 2 uncertain people in the summer of 1883, now standing as the people they had become through 16 years of choosing each other. The 4th time you could not leave, she said quietly, her face against his shoulder. The 4th and final time, he said, though it never felt like not leaving, it felt like arriving. She tilted her head back to look at him. That is a much better way to put it. I learned it from you, he said. You told me in July of 1883 that every time I came back I was coming back toward something rather than failing to leave something. You said it in different words, but that was what you meant. I said people, she said. I said you kept coming back for people. And you were the last one, he said. The most specific and irreplaceable one. After you, there was no reason to keep looking. She held him for a moment in the October evening, and the sunset did its final extravagant colors above the flat horizon, and somewhere in the town behind them, their children were in the warm house with its books and maps and the green ceramic teapot and all the accumulated furniture of a life lived fully and with intent. The town of Caldwell was not what it had been in 1883, and neither were the 2 people standing at its edge watching the sky. But the sky was the same enormous Kansas sky, and the land that stretched away from them was the same land that Marcus had spent 20 years measuring and recording, and Irene was the same person who had walked out of Nell Bright's back room carrying a crate that was too heavy, with dust on her cheekbone and her hat slightly crooked, and looked up to find a deputy standing at the door with his hat in his hands. Some things, Marcus had come to understand, are not accidents. They are the result of all the preceding accidents aligning in a particular way, the 3 departures and the 3 returns, and the 100 small daily choices of 2 people, finding out what they actually wanted as opposed to what they thought they were supposed to want. The result in his case was this: a house on the east side of Caldwell with 3 children in it, and a wife who looked at the world directly and honestly, and who had, at some point in the late summer of 1883, decided that he was worth the risk of needing someone. He had said goodbye to that town 3 separate times. She had been the 4th reason he could not leave. And standing there with her in the October dark, the last light of the sunset fading into deep blue above the western flatlands and the first stars appearing overhead, he was grateful for every wrong turn and every return and every mile of uncertain road that had delivered him, finally and irrevocably, to exactly where he was supposed to be. Behind them, from the direction of the house, came the clear carrying voice of James calling that supper was ready, and Samuel's higher voice joining in with the specific urgency of a 6-year-old who takes the subject of meals seriously, and Clara's calm interjection that they were only out on their evening walk and would be back in a moment. Marcus and Irene turned toward the voices of their children. They walked home through the cold October evening, side by side on the familiar road, past the buildings of the town they had both come to by separate routes and chosen, in their different ways, to call their own. The lights of Caldwell were warm in the windows on either side of Kisham Street, and the smoke from a dozen chimney stacks rose straight in the still air, and the sound of the town in its evening settled around them like something well made and honestly earned. At the door of the house, Marcus held it open, and Irene stepped past him into the warmth and light, and he followed her in, and the door closed behind them against the October cold. Inside, James had set the supper table with more care than usual, because he was 15 and understood now that the ordinary things of family life were worth the effort of being done well. Clara was reading a medical text she had ordered from Wichita, and was explaining something in it to Samuel, who was listening with more attention than he typically gave to things that were not maps or drawings. The smell of the meal Irene had started in the afternoon filled the kitchen with the specific warmth of a home in use. Irene hung her coat and went to the stove. Marcus sat down at the table where James had set his place, and Samuel climbed onto the bench beside him with the easy familiarity of a child who expects to be welcome. And Clara looked up from her book long enough to say something sharp and funny about the length of their walk. And Marcus Ellsworth, 44 years old, 3 times a man who had left and come back, looked around the table at the family he had built and felt, as he did every day in this house, the full and complete and uncomplicated certainty of a man who had arrived. The food was good and the conversation was loud, and the lamp over the table threw its warm circle of light, and outside the October wind came down from the north across the Kansas flatlands, cold and clear and full of the smell of the long season changing, and inside there was nothing missing at all.